I'd been debating whether to tell this story for years. Before I begin, I need to make one thing clear. Every word of this actually happened. I'm not exaggerating anything for effect, and I'm not going to fill the story with cliches just to make it sound scarier. I'm only going to tell it exactly the way I remember it. When I was a child, I started noticing strange little moments where I somehow knew things before they happened. Nothing dramatic. I'd know what someone in class was about to say before they said it, or I'd suddenly know the phone was going to ring seconds before it did. At that age, I just thought it was interesting, maybe even kind of cool. As I got older, it became more unsettling. I started experiencing intense déjà vu whenever I went somewhere unfamiliar. I'd suddenly feel as if I had already lived through that exact moment before, down to every word people were saying around me. Sometimes it lasted only seconds. Other times, it dragged on for 10 or 15 minutes. I'd sit there quietly mouthing people's sentences before they spoke, trying not to look terrified. Eventually, I started calling it a sensitivity. I didn't really know how else to describe it. I was around 14 when I realized that whatever this sensitivity was, it wasn't limited to people. It extended to something else. My family lived in Ireland, and during the Celtic Tiger years, my parents bought an old country house that was over 200 years old. They renovated the entire place from top to bottom. New roof, new floors, new walls, everything. We each got to choose our bedrooms, and I picked the attic. At first, it terrified me. Even after it had been cleaned and restored, there was still something wrong about it. The room itself looked beautiful when it was finished, but one thing bothered me from the start. A small hatch in the ceiling that led into a cramped boiler space above the attic. I hated looking at it. Something about that hatch filled me with dread. Before I had even spent a night there, I pushed my wardrobe beneath it and piled stuffed animals on top, just so I wouldn't have to see it every time I looked up. The first night in that room, I barely slept. All night long, I heard scratching and banging coming from above the ceiling. I tried convincing myself it was just an old house settling into the cold night air. Then, I heard footsteps. Not creaking wood, footsteps. Something small was running back and forth directly above me. It happened every single night after that. When I told my father, he laughed it off immediately. He said unless there was a 4-foot-tall man living in the ceiling, I was imagining things. Then came the usual explanation that I was dreaming. I knew I wasn't. Still, after a while, I forced myself to ignore it. Then other things started happening. I'd leave my room with the wardrobe doors closed, only to come back and find them hanging open again. Small decorations around the room would be moved slightly from where I'd left them. My father blamed uneven floors and loose hinges. But there was one thing nobody could explain: the feeling of being watched. The second I entered that room, I felt eyes on me, constantly. It was as though something stood just outside my vision, studying me every second I was there. Not long after that, the nightmares began. They were unlike normal dreams. They felt real in a way I still can't explain. Horrible images, horrible places, things I still don't like remembering. My mother later told me she would hear crying in the middle of the night and come upstairs to find me standing outside my bedroom door screaming hysterically. She'd ask me what was wrong, but apparently I never answered. I'd just stare at the floor and shake uncontrollably. The strange thing is, I don't remember any of it. Around that time, I changed completely. I became withdrawn and miserable. Every night in that room filled me with this crushing sadness that made no sense. I'd always been a happy kid before then. Then came the night everything got worse. I woke suddenly sometime after midnight. The moment my eyes opened, pure terror hit me so hard it felt physical. Something was in the room. I slowly turned my head toward the side of my bed. A tall black figure stood there, staring directly at me. Its head hung forward unnaturally, tilted down as if it were studying me. For a moment, I genuinely thought I was still dreaming. I sat up, rubbed my eyes, blinked hard. It didn't disappear. If anything, it looked startled that I could see it. The figure jerked backward, then slid down the side of my bed and disappeared into the darkness near the floor. I couldn't move. I just sat there frozen, quietly crying to myself until morning. I avoided that room for days afterward and slept downstairs on the couch. I barely ate. I barely slept. I was exhausted and terrified all the time. Eventually, out of sheer exhaustion, I forced myself back into the attic. One morning, after finally managing to fall asleep around sunrise, I woke again. The figure was inches from my face. Not in darkness this time. Daylight filled the room, and it was still there. I nearly lost my mind. After that, things became unbearable. I started waking up with scratches across my back and shoulders. Some nights I felt pressure around my throat as though invisible hands were slowly tightening while I tried to sleep. Breathing became difficult whenever I lay in that room. The depression that followed was overwhelming. I'd sit awake for hours feeling watched, feeling trapped, wondering if something in that room wanted me dead. My father still refused to believe me. My mother didn't. Eventually, she contacted our local priest. I wasn't religious, but by then I was desperate enough to try anything. The priest walked through the attic reading prayers, sprinkling holy water around the room and placing a cross from the Vatican above the bed. It didn't help. In the end, I moved into another bedroom and refused to sleep in the attic again. For about a year, things were quiet. Then, I moved away for college. I thought leaving home meant leaving everything behind. I moved into an old student house with a few close friends in a historic town. The building was around 150 years old. The noises started on the first night. Scratching in the walls, banging pipes, footsteps. We laughed it off at first. Then one evening I mentioned that I kept feeling my blankets tugging slightly while I tried to sleep. I expected everyone to joke about it, but one of my roommates went pale and admitted something had grabbed his foot during the night a few days earlier. After that, the atmosphere in the house changed. Every morning around 6, I heard faint crying coming from one corner of my bedroom wall. Whenever I called someone in to listen, it stopped immediately. My roommates started thinking I was imagining things, until they heard it too. Then came the switches turning on by themselves, loud bangs from empty rooms, doors moving, and eventually, the figure returned. One night I caught sight of it standing in the kitchen doorway watching me from the corner of my eye. The moment I looked directly at it, it vanished. I didn't tell anyone. Then one of my roommates admitted he'd seen the exact same thing in the bathroom days earlier. From that moment on, nobody felt comfortable in the house anymore. Then came the worst night. It was just me and the roommate who had seen the figure before. We were studying in the living room when a loud bang echoed through the house. Then another. Then dozens more. It sounded like something was racing through every room, slamming against walls and stomping across the floors. The noise grew louder and louder, until suddenly it stopped everywhere except my bedroom upstairs. My roommate froze mid-sentence while staring over my shoulder. I asked him what was wrong. He wouldn't answer at first. He just told me we needed to leave the room immediately and that I wasn't sleeping in my bedroom that night. When I kept pushing him, he finally admitted what he'd seen. A black figure sliding silently across the wall directly behind me. We locked ourselves in his room for the rest of the night and barely spoke. Sitting there in the dark, I started thinking about every strange thing that had happened throughout my life. The attic, the nightmares, the shadow figure, the old houses. And for the first time, a thought occurred to me that terrified me more than any ghost story ever could. Maybe the houses were never haunted. Maybe I was. I've always considered myself a rational person. Ghost stories never impressed me, and talk of demons or supernatural forces usually earned nothing more than an eye roll. Even now, as an adult, I find it easy to dismiss the idea that anything beyond the natural world could truly affect someone. Yet there is one part of my life I've never been able to explain away a series of experiences that completely contradicts what I believe. When I was a child, I heard voices. Not ordinary sounds like laughter, music, or people talking in another room. These were three distinct voices that spoke about me as if I were the subject of some private discussion. They knew my name. And whatever they wanted, it wasn't good. You can tell yourself they were nightmares or the imagination of an overactive child. Maybe that's true. I've spent years trying to convince myself of the same thing. But the memories remain vivid, and telling this story is the only way I know to finally release some of the weight it still carries. The clearest memory I have is also the earliest. I was around 7 years old, awkward in every possible way. I had a severe lisp, a stutter, and a blunt haircut that made me look perpetually uncomfortable. I was tiny, skinny in the arms and legs, but with a round stomach that made school photos unbearable. Despite all of that, I was generally a happy child, even though home life was difficult. My father drank heavily, though no one in the family openly acknowledged it. We simply went to church every Sunday and pretended everything was normal. At that age, I slept in a race car bed and listened to religious audiobooks before falling asleep. One night, after drifting off as usual, I woke to the sound of murmuring beneath my bedroom floor. My bed sat beside an old metal air vent that connected directly to the bathroom below. Through the vent, I could sometimes hear conversations or see the sink downstairs if the light was on. At first, I assumed the voices belonged to my parents, speaking quietly in the bathroom. Then I realized there were 3 voices, 2 men and 1 woman. I sat up slowly, confused rather than frightened. From where I lay, I couldn't understand everything clearly, so I leaned closer to the vent to listen. This is the closest I can remember to what they said. "She's asleep. She's only a child. Of course she's asleep." Soft laughter followed. "We don't have much time. She'll wake up. This is kinder for her. There is no kindness." Every word felt directed at me. After that final sentence, silence filled the room. I remember sitting frozen in bed, trying desperately to convince myself I was dreaming. I pinched my arm, rubbed my eyes, even whispered to myself that none of it was real. But my heart was pounding too hard for me to believe it completely. Still, I told no one. I had learned very young not to wake my parents at night, no matter what frightened me, so eventually I forced myself back to sleep. For several weeks, nothing happened. I convinced myself it had all been a nightmare. Then the voices returned. This time they were discussing ways to hurt me. The details changed constantly. Sometimes they spoke about burning me. Other nights, they mentioned kidnapping me or forcing information out of me, though I had no idea what information they meant. The plans themselves seemed less important than the simple fact that they wanted me afraid. And somehow, over time, I became used to them. That's the part that disturbs me most now. I was lonely as a child, isolated in many ways, and eventually the voices became strangely familiar. Terrifying, yes, but familiar. They knew my name. They returned, night after night. In some twisted way, they became companions. The first male voice was cold and emotionless, always focused on what needed to happen. He never said my name. The second man sounded calmer, almost sympathetic. He insisted I should be asleep before they did anything, as if he believed pain would somehow be easier that way. He used my name often. The woman frightened me the most. Her voice was rough and hateful, and whenever she spoke my name, it sounded contaminated, like something disgusting. Eventually, I began forcing myself to stay awake so I could listen to them longer. I became convinced that if I fell asleep, something terrible would happen. Night after night, I sat awake in bed, listening to cassette tapes while fighting exhaustion. If I managed to stay awake until sunrise, I felt victorious. If I fell asleep, I felt weak. The lack of sleep slowly consumed me. School became exhausting. My thoughts became confused and paranoid. Yet every night, I repeated the same ritual: stay awake, listen, survive. I even tried to catch whoever was beneath my room. I would turn on the bathroom light before bed, hoping to look through the vent and finally see them. But somehow, the light was always off by the time I returned to my room. Every attempt failed, making me question myself more and more. Eventually, the fear changed into something worse. I started believing the voices were right. Maybe I deserved whatever they planned for me. Maybe staying awake forever wasn't possible. Maybe I was losing my mind. Finally, completely exhausted, I decided to stop fighting it. I let myself sleep. I slept for nearly 36 hours. My mother checked on me repeatedly, thinking I must have been sick, but I felt strangely peaceful. And when I woke up, the voices were gone. They never returned during the rest of my childhood. Looking back now, part of me wants to dismiss everything as stress, fear, or a child's imagination. That explanation would certainly make the most sense. But another part of me still remembers those nights too clearly, the voices beneath the floor, speaking softly in the dark as if they were waiting for me to fall asleep. Dark, freezing, and unsettling. Those were the only words that ever truly fit the house where I spent most of my childhood. It always felt buried in shadow, the kind of place where winter cold seeped through the walls and never fully left. And no matter the season, there was something wrong with it. At night, strange noises drifted up from the cellar, scratching, shuffling, soft thuds that echoed through the floorboards. The sounds always unnerved me, though I never admitted it to my mother. I thought I was too old to be scared of creaking pipes in an old basement. Ever since my father abandoned us when I was 7, I'd tried to act like the man of the house. I swore I would never become anything like him. As far as my father is concerned, that's all I care to say. It was just me, my mother Linda, and my uncle Kevin living out there on an isolated patch of land in Steinen, Indiana. Steinen was the kind of town people only passed through by mistake. Nothing but empty roads, dead fields, and silence. I was homeschooled, so I never had friends. Honestly, I barely saw anyone my own age at all. We almost never left the property, unless my mother needed groceries from town. The only person I was truly close to was Uncle Kevin. When I was younger, he used to sit beside my bed at night and tell me ghost stories. My mother hated it. "Knock it off, Kev," she'd snap from the hallway. "You're going to give him nightmares." And she was right. The nightmares followed me for years, clinging to the corners of my thoughts like cobwebs. Kevin's favorite story was about a creature with twisted limbs and hollow black eyes. According to him, if you stayed awake too late, the thing would crawl into your room and hide in your closet, watching you until morning. It was obviously just a story meant to scare me into sleeping, but even after all those years, I still caught myself thinking about that creature in the dark. One night, after fighting a brutal headache all evening, I decided to go to bed early. I buried myself beneath the blankets, trying to shut out the pounding in my skull. After setting my glasses on the nightstand, I switched off the light. The darkness felt strange that night. Not empty alive. I stared into the pitch-black room, unable to look away, as though something deep inside my mind was pulling me toward it. It felt less like looking into darkness and more like falling into it. Then came the scratching. A slow scrape against the window above my bed. My eyes snapped open. I froze, listening. It had to be a branch, I told myself. Just the wind dragging something across the glass. But then a thought hit me hard enough to make my stomach twist. There were no trees near my window. Still, I forced myself to stay in bed. I kept telling myself it was exhaustion, paranoia, anything but what my mind was beginning to imagine. Somehow, though, sleep refused to come. It felt like something wanted me awake. The next morning, the sound still echoed in my head. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Eventually, my thoughts drifted toward the cellar. I hadn't gone down there in over a year. The basement smelled of mold and wet wood. Dust hung thick in the air, and cobwebs draped the corners like old curtains. Cardboard boxes were stacked against the walls, collapsing with age. While digging through them, I found an old drawing I'd made as a child. The second I saw it, my blood ran cold. It was a sketch of a tall, twisted figure with long limbs and black, empty eyes. No mouth, no nose, barely even human. Rain poured around the creature in the drawing, and beneath it, written in uneven, childish letters, were the words, "Please stay awake." I stared at the page for what felt like forever, trying desperately to remember why I'd drawn it. Eventually, I folded it up and shoved it into my pocket before rushing back upstairs. Outside, rain clouds had already swallowed the sky. Later that evening, exhaustion overtook me, and I passed out almost instantly. When I woke again, the clock beside my bed read 3 a.m., The room was colder than I'd ever felt before. Moonlight spilled through the window, pale and unnatural. As I glanced outside, I saw movement crossing the yard. Something tall, something thin. The moment it noticed me watching, it darted behind a tree. My chest tightened. It looked exactly like the thing from my drawing. I bolted from my room and ran to Uncle Kevin's bedroom, shaking him awake. "Kevin! Wake up!" He rubbed his eyes, confused. "What's wrong?" "There's someone outside." He sighed, clearly irritated. "Probably an animal." "No," I whispered. "Please, I know what I saw." After a long pause, Kevin grabbed the shotgun from beneath his bed. We stepped outside, into the freezing rain-soaked night. I pointed toward the tree where I'd seen it hiding. Kevin searched the property for nearly half an hour, but found nothing. Eventually, he lowered the shotgun and shook his head. "There's nobody out here," he said. "Go back to bed. Just lock the doors tonight." But I knew he was wrong. Something had been out there. Back in my room, I hid beneath the blankets while the wind screamed outside. Then came the tapping against the window again. Tap, tap, tap. Each knock grew louder and faster, until it sounded like fists hammering against the glass. I thought the window would shatter. Then suddenly, silence. No wind. No tapping. Nothing. Relief washed over me for exactly 1 second before I heard a voice whispered directly beside my ear. "Please, stay awake." I ran into the hallway, ready to sprint toward my mother's room. That's when I saw it. The creature stood at the far end of the hall, holding Uncle Kevin's body like a broken doll. His chest had been ripped open, and carved deep into his skin were the words, "Please stay awake." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I stumbled into my mother's room and found her lying in the middle of the floor, drenched in blood. One of her arms had been torn completely away. Written beside her in blood were the same horrifying words, "Please stay awake." I collapsed sobbing onto the floor. When I looked up again, the creature was gone. I don't remember much after that. The police arrived hours later and found me curled beside my mother's corpse, covered in blood and barely able to speak. I told them everything about the creature, the drawing, the scratching at the window. They didn't believe me. Why would they? All they saw was a terrified boy standing over two mutilated bodies. Now I sit alone in this freezing prison cell. It's dark here, quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your skull. Outside, rain taps softly against the barred window. And just a moment ago, I heard scratching on the glass.